The Galactic Royal Academy stood like a crystalline monument against the purple sky of Nexus Prime, its towers reaching toward the three moons that hung in eternal orbit. For 8,000 years, the Academy had trained the future rulers of the galaxy's most prestigious civilizations. Every species that mattered had sent their finest heirs to walk these halls, to prove their worthiness to rule among the stars. Stood at the Academy gates, his worn travel pack slung over his shoulder and his acceptance letter crumpled in his sweaty palm. The other students flowing through the entrance moved with the fluid grace of beings born to power. They glided on platforms, their crystalline skin catching the light like living jewels. The massive delegates thundered past on 6 legs, their ceremonial armor gleaming. Even the smallest beings present, the nobles, commanded respect with their telepathic auras that made the air shimmer around them. Then there was human, barely 5'10", brown hair, average build, wearing clothes that had seen better decades. His species wasn't even supposed to be here. Humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel 300 years ago, making them galactic infants compared to civilizations that had been exploring space since before Earth's dinosaurs went extinct. The acceptance letter had arrived 6 months ago, delivered by a courier drone that had nearly been shot down by Earth's orbital defense grid. Nobody on Earth understood why it had been selected. He certainly didn't understand it himself. His grades were decent but not exceptional. His family had no royal blood, no political connections. His father repaired atmospheric processors on mining stations, and his mother taught basic xenobiology at a community college on Mars. The Academy's admission requirements were legendary throughout the galaxy. Candidates needed to demonstrate not just intelligence, but the indefinable qualities that made a true ruler: wisdom, courage, the ability to command respect from beings vastly different from themselves. Most species spent generations preparing their chosen heirs for the entrance examinations. Had filled out his application on a dare from his roommate at university. Now, walking through corridors that hummed with technology his species was only beginning to understand, felt like an ant that had wandered into a convention of eagles. The other students spoke in languages that predated human civilization, their conversations flowing seamlessly between topics that spanned centuries and star systems. They discussed trade negotiations with the merchant princes of Andromeda, military campaigns in the outer spiral, philosophical debates that had been ongoing since before humans discovered fire. His first class was taught by Professor N, whose species had achieved collective consciousness 12,000 years ago. The professor's third eye, the one that could peer directly into the quantum structure of thoughts, fixed on as he entered the classroom. "Ah, our human student," Professor N said, his words creating visible ripples in the air. "How quaint. Please take a seat. We were discussing the emotional infrastructure necessary for ruling multi-species civilizations." Found an empty chair between a prince whose skin was currently cycling through colors that indicated deep contemplation, and a young whose ceremonial tattoos marked her as heir to 17 star systems. Neither acknowledged his presence. "The key to effective governance," Professor N continued, "lies in understanding that emotion itself is not universal. The experience what we might call love as a form of controlled biochemical warfare. The feel joy only when inflicting precisely calculated amounts of pain. A ruler must adapt their emotional responses to command beings whose very feelings might be toxic to their own species' survival." The professor's gaze swept the room. "Princess, how would you handle a trade dispute between the emotional humans and the logic-driven computational collective?" The princess rose gracefully, her skin shifting to the deep blue of serious thought. "Honored professor, one would establish separate negotiation protocols. Humans respond to appeals to fairness and emotional connection, while the collective requires mathematical proofs of mutual benefit. A wise ruler would present the same agreement using different psychological frameworks for each species." "Excellent. The emotional manipulation required is subtle but effective." The professor turned to, "And you, human, how would your species handle ruling beings whose emotions could literally kill you?" The classroom fell silent. Could feel dozens of alien eyes upon him, waiting for him to reveal the primitive limitations of his young species. He thought about the question seriously, remembering something his grandmother had told him about dealing with people who were different from yourself. "I wouldn't try to manipulate anyone," said quietly. "I'd be honest about what I didn't understand and ask them to teach me. If their emotions could kill me, I'd want to understand why, not figure out how to work around it. Maybe the real question isn't how to rule beings who are different from us, but whether anyone should be ruling anyone else at all. The silence stretched longer. Several students exchanged glances that clearly indicated they thought had just demonstrated why humans didn't belong at the academy. Professor N's third eye dilated fully, its quantum sensors probing with uncomfortable intensity. Interesting, the professor said finally. Naive but interesting, class dismissed. As students filed out, heard whispered conversations in a dozen languages. The tone was universal: amusement, condescension, and a kind of second-hand embarrassment that someone so obviously unqualified had somehow slipped through the admission process. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. In strategic military planning, suggested that maybe conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than superior firepower. In galactic economics, he questioned why trade needed to involve exploitation of less developed worlds. In diplomatic protocol, he asked why ceremony and hierarchy were more important than clear communication. His professors treated him with the patient condescension reserved for particularly slow children. His classmates simply ignored him. During group projects, found himself consistently excluded from planning sessions, his contributions dismissed before he could finish speaking. When teams were chosen for the practical exercises that made up half their coursework, was inevitably the last one picked, relegated to tasks that kept him safely out of the way. The academy's social hierarchy was as rigid as its academic structure. The students, with their advanced collective consciousness, naturally formed the intellectual elite. The heirs commanded respect through their species' military prowess. The princes and princesses dominated cultural discussions with their artistic achievements that spanned. Humans, as represented by, ranked somewhere below the academy's maintenance staff. The breaking point came during the monthly assessment of worthiness, a formal evaluation where students demonstrated their progress in the core skills of rulership. Each student presented a solution to a real galactic crisis, defending their approach before a panel of former academy graduates who now held positions of actual power throughout the galaxy. Watched as his classmates presented sophisticated analyses of complex situations. Princess outlined a detailed plan for managing resource conflicts in the Outer Rim that involved carefully calculated military pressure and economic incentives. Prince, or of the demonstrated how superior firepower could end a civil war in the disputed sectors while minimizing collateral damage. A young collective mind showed how telepathic manipulation could resolve trade disputes without any of the involved parties realizing they had been influenced. The solutions were elegant, efficient, and absolutely ruthless. Once turn came, he approached the presentation podium with his hands shaking slightly. The crisis he had been assigned involved a planetary system where 3 different species were fighting over mining rights to a moon that contained rare elements essential for faster-than-light communication. The conflict had been escalating for decades, threatening to destabilize an entire sector. "Honored evaluators," began, his voice steadier than he felt. "I spent a lot of time studying this situation, and I think everyone's been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking which species deserves these mining rights, maybe we should be asking why any of them need to fight over resources in the first place." He activated the holographic display, showing detailed scans of the disputed moon. "The rare elements everyone's fighting over, they're not actually that rare. Our current mining techniques are just incredibly inefficient. If we shared extraction technology and worked together, there would be enough resources for everyone. The moon is big enough to support collaborative mining operations, and the different species actually have complementary strengths that would make their joint operation more effective than any single species' effort." The panel of evaluators exchanged glances. One of them, a distinguished admiral whose military decorations covered half his chest, leaned forward. "Student, you are suggesting that beings who have been enemies for generations simply choose to trust each other and work together. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how intelligent species actually behave." "Maybe," replied, "but they're fighting because they're scared there won't be enough for everyone. If we could prove there would be enough, maybe they wouldn't need to be enemies anymore. Sometimes people fight because they think they have to, not because they want to." Another evaluator, whose collective consciousness spoke with the weight of 10,000 minds, projected its thoughts directly into his brain. The sensation was like having ice water poured into his skull. Young human, your species' optimism about the nature of intelligent life is touching. However, governance requires accepting the reality that most conflicts stem from fundamental incompatibilities between species, not mere misunderstandings. Felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he pressed on. What if they're not fundamentally incompatible? What if we just haven't tried hard enough to understand each other? In the files I read about this conflict, nobody has ever actually asked all three species to sit down together and talk about what they really need. Everyone just assumed they couldn't work together. The silence that followed was profound. Could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the vast evaluation chamber. The panel members looked at him with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed disgust. Finally, the lead evaluator spoke. Her species was unknown to, something ancient and powerful that communicated through patterns of light that played across her translucent skin. Student, your naivety is so complete that it approaches a form of mental disability. You will receive a failing grade for this assessment. We recommend that you consider whether this institution is appropriate for someone of your limited understanding of reality. As left the evaluation chamber, he passed other students waiting for their turns. Their expressions told him that news of his spectacular failure had already spread. Some looked amused, others uncomfortable, as if watching someone humiliate themselves was entertaining but also slightly disturbing. That night, sitting alone in his dormitory room while his roommate attended a party he hadn't been invited to, seriously considered packing his bags and taking the next transport back to Earth. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe humans really weren't ready for this level of galactic politics. Maybe some species were just naturally better at ruling others. He was composing his letter of withdrawal when his door chimed. Standing in the corridor was the last person he expected to see, Instructor Aura, the Academy's most feared professor. She taught advanced rulership theory to final-year students and had never spoken to directly. Aura was a draconis, one of the ancient dragon species whose civilization predated most others by tens of thousands of years. Her people had ruled vast interstellar empires when most current galactic powers were still discovering agriculture. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her scales shifting between deep gold and crimson, her eyes holding intelligence that seemed to stretch back to the dawn of galactic civilization. "Student," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made his bones vibrate. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Followed Instructor Aura through corridors he had never seen before, deeper into the Academy's ancient heart. The walls here were older, carved from single blocks of stone that hummed with embedded technology, so advanced it seemed like magic. Bioluminescent patterns flowed through the rock like veins of living light, responding to their presence. "Do you know how old this academy is, human?" Aura asked as they walked. 8,000 years, replied, struggling to keep pace with her long strides. 8,000 years since its current incarnation. But this institution has existed in one form or another for over 40,000 years. My people built the first version when most of today's great civilizations were still single-planet species trying to understand fire. They entered a vast chamber that had never seen on any academy map. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above them, and the walls were covered with what looked like living murals that shifted and moved, depicting scenes from galactic history. Saw the rise and fall of empires, the birth of civilizations, the first tentative steps of countless species into space. Every instructor here is chosen from the finest minds of their respective civilizations, Aura continued. We have taught the rulers of empires, the architects of peace treaties that lasted, the military strategists whose campaigns are still studied across the galaxy. Do you understand what this means? Felt smaller than ever, that I don't belong here. Aura's laugh was like thunder rolling through crystal caves. That your professors are idiots. Stopped walking, what? The dragon lady turned to face him, her eyes glowing with inner fire. 40,000 years, human. Do you know what we have accomplished in 40,000 years of training the galaxy's rulers? War. Endless, inevitable war. Species manipulating each other with increasing sophistication. Empires rising and falling in cycles as predictable as stellar formation. We have created the most educated, capable, ruthless rulers in galactic history, and the result is a universe in constant conflict. She gestured to the moving murals around them, began to see patterns he hadn't noticed before. The same cycles, repeated over and over. species rising to power, conquering their neighbors, being conquered in turn. Diplomatic solutions that lasted only until the next generation decided they could get a better deal through violence. Every technique your classmates are learning, every strategy they master, every manipulation they perfect, all of it has been tried before. The collective mind approach to governance. It works beautifully until they encounter a species that cannot be mentally influenced. The philosophy of peace through superior firepower. It creates peace through extinction. The cultural dominance. It generates resentment that explodes into revolution every few centuries. Found his voice. Then why do you keep teaching the same things? Because until now, these were the only approaches that existed. Every species that achieved interstellar capability developed along similar lines. They became more sophisticated, more technologically advanced, more capable of complex reasoning. But they remained fundamentally the same. They competed for resources, they established hierarchies, they ruled through fear or force or manipulation. Ara's scales shifted to a deep purple that somehow understood meant profound sadness. Do you know why the Draconis are the Academy's most senior instructors? Because we are the oldest civilization still in existence, and we have seen every possible approach to governance fail eventually. We have watched species destroy themselves with the very sophistication we taught them. They walked deeper into the chamber, approaching what looked like a throne carved from a single massive crystal. The crystal was dark, but as they drew closer, images began to form within it. Saw battles on a scale that comprehension, entire star systems consumed by conflict, species fleeing dying worlds they had poisoned with their own success. My people ruled an empire that spanned half the galaxy, Ara said softly. We were wise, powerful, technologically advanced beyond current understanding. We treated our subjects fairly by our standards. We maintained peace for thousands of years. And in the end, we nearly destroyed everything we had built because we could not conceive of a way to rule that didn't involve ruling. Stared at the images in the crystal. What happened? We encountered a species that refused to be ruled, not because they were rebellious or warlike, but because they literally could not comprehend the concept of one being having authority over another. They had no hierarchy, no government as we understood it, no leaders or followers. When we tried to incorporate them into our empire, our entire governmental structure began to break down. Our subjects started asking why they needed rulers at all. The images in the crystal shifted, showing a civilization unlike anything had seen before. Beings worked together without anyone giving orders, solved complex problems through discussion rather than decree, shared resources without any enforcement mechanism beyond mutual understanding. The species was called the Harmony. They had achieved interstellar travel without ever developing weapons because they had never needed them. They explored space not to conquer but to understand. They approached us with curiosity rather than fear or aggression, and that simple difference nearly tore our empire apart. Felt a strange recognition stirring in his chest. What happened to them? Ara's expression grew darker. The other galactic powers decided they were too dangerous. A species that could inspire rebellion simply by existing could not be allowed to spread their influence. My people were convinced to join the extermination campaign. We told ourselves it was necessary for galactic stability. The images in the crystal went dark. We succeeded. The Harmony was eliminated, their world sterilized, their very existence erased from official galactic history. And in doing so, we destroyed the one example we had of a truly different way of organizing intelligent life. For 30,000 years since then, we have been teaching the same failed approaches to governance, because we convinced ourselves no alternatives were possible. Felt sick, why are you telling me this? Because your species approaches problems exactly like the Harmony did. Ara turned to face him directly. Every answer you have given, every suggestion you have made, every question you have asked, it mirrors their approach so closely that when I first observed your classes, I thought somehow the Harmony had returned. The chamber seemed to spin around, but the other instructors think I'm naive, stupid. They say my ideas could never work. Of course they do, because if your ideas could work, then everything they have spent their lives teaching, every system they have helped to build, every ruler they have trained, all of it would be revealed as unnecessary at best, actively harmful at worst. Ara's voice carried the weight of, do you understand what that would mean for them? Thought about his professors, his classmates, the entire structure of the academy. They would have to admit they were wrong about everything. More than that, They would have to face the possibility that billions of beings have died in conflicts that could have been prevented if anyone had been willing to consider that there might be a better way. They stood in silence for a long moment, felt the weight of galactic history pressing down on him, the accumulated failure of 40,000 years of supposedly advanced civilization. "The final test is in 3 days," Aura said eventually. "Every student who has ever taken that test has faced the same scenario, a galactic crisis that can only be resolved through the application of superior force, economic pressure, or psychological manipulation. Every student chooses one of those 3 approaches and is graded on how effectively they would implement it." "What's the test this year?" "The same scenario that destroyed the Harmony. A species has been discovered that refuses to acknowledge any form of governmental authority. They pose no military threat, make no territorial demands, simply exist in a way that threatens the philosophical foundations of every major galactic power. The test is designed to measure how effectively students can justify and plan their elimination." Felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And you expect me to fail like everyone else?" "No," Aura said, her voice carrying an odd note of hope. "I expect you to do something that no student has ever done in 40,000 years of this academy's existence. I expect you to refuse to take the test as designed." The dragon lady began walking back toward the chamber entrance, leaving standing alone beside the dark crystal throne. "The final test begins at dawn in 3 days. You have until then to decide whether you want to be the first human to graduate from this academy, or the first being in 400 centuries to suggest there might be a better way." Spent the next 2 days in a state of mental turmoil. He attended his regular classes, but found himself barely listening to lectures on optimal taxation strategies and efficient resource exploitation. Instead, he found himself thinking about the Harmony, imagining a species that had achieved everything the galaxy's great civilizations claim to want: peace, prosperity, exploration, growth, without anyone being in charge of anyone else. His classmates noticed his distraction, but attributed it to pre-test anxiety. Princess actually offered him her notes on historical precedents for dealing with non-compliant species, apparently taking pity on him. Prince or suggested that if was planning to argue for military solutions, he should emphasize the humanitarian benefits of swift elimination over prolonged conflict. Even the instructors seemed to soften their attitudes slightly. Professor N mentioned that while humans might not be naturally suited for galactic leadership, there could be useful roles for them in supporting positions within established hierarchies. The collective that taught strategic planning projected reassuring thoughts into his mind about how failure at the academy did not necessarily mean failure in life. Everyone was being kind to him because they all assumed he was going to fail spectacularly and wanted to soften the blow. On the morning of the final test, stood with his 43 classmates in the academy's grand assembly chamber. The room was designed to intimidate, with crystalline walls that amplified sound and light until every word spoken carried impossible weight. Above them, holographic displays showed the current state of galactic civilization: trade routes, military deployments, diplomatic negotiations, the vast complex machinery of governance that kept thousands of species from tearing each other apart. Or tried to keep them from tearing each other apart. Looking at the displays with new eyes, could see the underlying tensions, the barely controlled conflicts, the endless cycle of negotiation and threat that passed for peace. The test scenario materialized in the center of the chamber as a detailed holographic simulation, a star system on the edge of known space, inhabited by a species called the had achieved faster-than-light travel and had begun exploring neighboring systems, making contact with other species. They were technologically advanced, intellectually sophisticated, and completely impossible to govern. They have no leaders, the test parameters explained. No government, no hierarchy, no system for making collective decisions that other species can recognize or negotiate with. When contacted by established galactic powers, they respond with curiosity and offers of friendship, but refuse to acknowledge any authority beyond their own individual consciences. They will not sign treaties, accept territorial restrictions, or submit to any form of external control. The scenario continued to unfold. Other species in the region were becoming agitated. How could you conduct diplomacy with beings who had no representatives? How could you enforce agreements with people who claimed no one had the authority to bind anyone else to anything? How could you maintain galactic stability when an entire species refused to participate in the basic structures that made civilization possible? Your task, announced the chief examiner, is to develop a comprehensive solution to the problem that maintains galactic stability while minimizing negative consequences. You have 4 hours. Watched as his classmates immediately began working on their responses. He could see their approaches taking shape: military containment, economic isolation, psychological manipulation designed to force the to develop governmental structures that other species could work with. All the standard solutions, applied with varying degrees of sophistication and restraint. He thought about the harmony, eliminated 30,000 years ago for the crime of existing differently. He thought about 40,000 years of galactic civilization that had produced nothing but increasingly sophisticated forms of the same fundamental failures. He thought about Instructor Aura's challenge, and then began to write. When the 4 hours ended, students presented their solutions in order of academic ranking, as the lowest performing student in the class would present last. Princess went first, outlining an elegant plan for economic pressure that would force the to develop trade representatives, who could then be gradually expanded into a formal government structure. The beauty of this approach, she explained to the panel of examiners, is that the will believe they are choosing to create leadership voluntarily, never realizing they have been manipulated into compliance. Prince or proposed a military solution disguised as protection. We established defensive installations throughout space, ostensibly to protect them from potential threats. Over time, these installations become centers of administration, and they become accustomed to following the guidance of our military commanders for their own safety. A young collective outlined a sophisticated psychological campaign that would gradually alter thought patterns through carefully designed cultural exchanges, eventually making them psychologically incapable of functioning without hierarchical guidance. Each presentation was more sophisticated than the last, demonstrating mastery of advanced techniques for managing non-compliant populations. The examiners nodded approvingly, occasionally asking technical questions about implementation details or potential resistance factors. When's turn came, the chamber fell into the familiar silence that accompanied his academic performances. He approached the presentation platform with a single sheet of handwritten notes, his hands trembling slightly. "Honored examiners," he began, his voice barely carrying to the back of the chamber. "I've been thinking about this problem for 4 hours, and I realize I can't solve it." Murmurs rippled through the assembled students. Several examiners exchanged glances that clearly indicated this was going about as well as they had expected. "I can't solve it," continued, "because it's not actually a problem. They aren't doing anything wrong. They're not threatening anyone, they're not taking resources that belong to others, they're not trying to force their way of life on anyone else. They're just existing in a way that's different from what we're used to." The chief examiner interrupted. "Student, the problem is clearly defined. This refusal to participate in standard governmental structures threatens galactic stability. How do you propose to address this threat?" "That's just it," said, his voice growing stronger. "Why is it a threat? Why does everyone in the galaxy have to organize themselves the same way? They have achieved faster-than-light travel, which means they're intelligent and capable. They're offering friendship and cooperation. The only thing they won't do is let someone else be in charge of them. Why should they have to?" Professor N spoke from the examiner panel. "Student, you are demonstrating the same naive optimism that has characterized your entire academic performance. Governance exists because it is necessary. Without hierarchical authority structures, large-scale cooperation becomes impossible." "But they have large-scale cooperation," replied. "They built starships. They coordinate exploration missions. They share resources and knowledge. They're doing all the things government is supposed to enable just without anyone being in charge." "Temporary cooperation based on shared interests," interjected another examiner. "Such arrangements inevitably break down under pressure. When resources become scarce, when conflicts arise, when difficult decisions must be made, someone must have the authority to choose a course of action." Took a deep breath. What if they don't break down? What if we just think they have to because that's the only system we've ever known? The chamber erupted in whispers. Several students looked genuinely shocked that was questioning fundamental assumptions about civilization itself. "Moreover," continued, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Even if the way of life eventually fails, why is that our problem to solve? Shouldn't they have the right to try their approach and succeed or fail on their own merits? Because their failure would destabilize the entire region, the chief examiner said coldly. Other species might be influenced by their example. The carefully maintained balance of galactic civilization could collapse. So we're going to destroy them to prevent other people from getting ideas. The silence that followed was deafening. Could feel the weight of 40,000 years of galactic civilization pressing down on him, all the accumulated wisdom of the ages arrayed against his simple human confusion. "Student," said a voice from the back of the examiner panel. Instructor Ara rose to her full height, her scales shifting to deep gold. "Are you suggesting that this academy has been teaching incorrect principles for 40?" Every eye in the chamber turned to. He could feel his classmates' shock and embarrassment on his behalf. His professors looked like they were watching a traffic accident happen in slow motion. The examiners waited with the patience of beings who had seen every possible form of student failure and were merely waiting to see what specific variety this would turn out to be. Thought about everything he had learned during his time at the academy. The sophisticated techniques for managing populations, the elegant theories of optimal governance, the careful balance of fear and incentive that kept galactic civilization functioning. All of it brilliant, all of it refined over thousands of years by minds far superior to his own. And all of it based on the assumption that the way things were was the only way things could be. "Yes," said quietly, "I think you've been teaching the wrong things for 40,000 years." The explosion of reaction was immediate. Students shouted in multiple languages. Several examiners stood up from their seats. The holographic displays showing galactic civilization flickered and wavered as if responding to the chaos in the room. "How dare you?" Princess Skin flashed angry red. "My family has ruled 17 star systems for 3,000 years using principles taught by this academy." "And how many wars have your family fought in those 3,000 years?" asked. "That's not the point. Conflict is inevitable. Government exists to manage conflict, not prevent it." "Why is conflict inevitable?" Felt something changing inside him, a clarity he had never experienced before. "Why do we assume that intelligent beings have to fight each other? Why do we take it for granted that someone always has to be in charge?" Prince Or's voice thundered across the chamber. "Because without leadership there is chaos. Without hierarchy there is no coordination. Without authority there is no justice." They seem to have coordination without hierarchy. They share resources without anyone forcing them to. They explore space together without anyone giving orders. Maybe what we call justice is just the biggest person deciding what they want everyone else to do. The chief examiner slammed his gavel against the podium, a sound like breaking crystal that cut through the shouting. "Student, you will present a proper solution to the assigned problem, or you will be dismissed from this academy immediately." Looked around the chamber at the faces staring at him. His classmates, the future rulers of galactic civilization, trained in the most sophisticated techniques of governance ever developed. His professors, the finest minds of their respective species, dedicated to passing on of accumulated wisdom about how to manage intelligent life. All of them convinced that the only choice was which method to use to eliminate or control a species, whose only crime was refusing to be ruled. "I won't," said. The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. "I won't present a solution to destroying them because destroying them would be wrong. I won't help you figure out how to force them to accept rulers, because maybe they're right not to want rulers. I won't participate in 40,000 years of the same mistakes just because everyone's too invested in the current system to admit there might be a better way." Set his notes down on the podium and looked directly at the examiner panel. "You want to know what I think the real problem is? The problem isn't the problem is that every other species in the galaxy is so terrified of the possibility that they might not need to be governed that they're willing to commit genocide to avoid considering the question." Instructor Ara stepped forward, her massive form dominating the center of the chamber. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the crystalline walls sing in response. "Student," she said, "you have just committed the greatest act of academic heresy in the history of this institution. You have rejected not merely a particular approach to governance, but the fundamental assumptions upon which all governance is based." felt his knees shaking but kept his voice steady. Yes, ma'am. You have suggested that 40,000 years of accumulated wisdom from the greatest minds in galactic history amounts to nothing more than sophisticated barbarism. Yes, ma'am. You have proposed that every government, every hierarchy, every system of authority that maintains order among the stars is not merely flawed, but fundamentally unnecessary. Yes, I think so. Ara's scales shifted through a complex pattern of colors that had never seen before. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every being in the chamber could hear it perfectly. Congratulations. You are the first student in the history of this academy to pass the final test. The chamber erupted in chaos again, but different this time. Instead of outrage, there was confusion, shock, desperate attempts to understand what had just happened. Students and examiners alike stared at Ara as if she had just announced that gravity worked backwards. The final test, Ara continued, her voice cutting through the noise, was never about finding the best way to eliminate the final test was to determine whether any student was capable of recognizing that they should not be eliminated at all. She turned to address the entire chamber. For 400 centuries, every student who sat in this room chose some variation of force, manipulation, or elimination. Every student accepted the fundamental premise that beings who refuse to be governed must be made to submit or be destroyed. Every student failed to question whether that premise might be wrong. Felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. You mean, this was all? A test of whether anyone could break free from the assumptions they had been taught. A test of whether any being educated in our traditions of governance could recognize that those traditions might be flawed beyond repair. Ara's attention swept across the assembled students and faculty. They are not a crisis to be managed. They are an opportunity to learn. They represent the first chance in 30,000 years to discover whether intelligent life can organize itself in ways that do not require some beings to have power over others. The chief examiner found his voice. Instructor Ara, this is highly irregular. The test parameters were clearly defined. Student failed to provide any viable solution to the assigned problem, because he recognized that the assigned problem was based on false assumptions. Ara's eyes glowed with an inner fire that had been building for. How many species have we eliminated because they threatened our ideas about how civilization must work? How many alternatives have we destroyed because we were afraid they might prove our methods unnecessary? She gestured to the holographic displays still showing the complex machinery of galactic governance. Look around you. Look at what 40,000 years of our best efforts have produced. Wars that span centuries. Oppression so sophisticated it convinces the oppressed they are free. Entire species enslaved to economic systems that benefit only those with the power to manipulate them. This is what we call success. Professor and stood up from the examiner panel. Instructor Ara, you are suggesting that we abandon civilization itself. Without governance, without hierarchy, without someone making decisions, society would collapse into chaos. Would it? Found himself speaking, his voice stronger than it had ever been. Or would it collapse into something different, something we've never been willing to try because we were too afraid of losing the power we have? He looked around the chamber at faces that seemed to be seeing him clearly for the first time. What if they aren't broken? What if they're not missing something essential? What if they've found something we lost thousands of years ago, and our first instinct is to destroy it because it makes us question everything we think we know about ourselves? The silence stretched, filled with the weight of possibilities that had been buried under of certainty. Finally, Instructor Ara spoke. The Academy will be suspending all current curricula pending a fundamental review of our educational objectives. Student, you will be our first graduate under the new criteria. Your first assignment will be to serve as humanity's ambassador to the... Felt the words wash over him like a tide that was carrying away everything he thought he understood about the universe. I don't know how to be an ambassador. Neither does anyone else when it comes to dealing with a truly free people. Ara's laugh rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. Perhaps that is exactly why you are the right person for the job. As the assembly dissolved into heated discussions and frantic planning sessions, found himself standing alone at the podium where everything had changed. Through the great windows of the chamber, he could see the stars wheeling overhead, each one representing possibilities that no one had been brave enough to explore. Tomorrow, he would begin learning how to communicate with a species that had never known rulers. Tomorrow, the galaxy would begin its first experiment in 40,000 years with the possibility that power might not be necessary for civilization. Tomorrow, everything would be different. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the academy, felt like he belonged exactly where he was.